My lord, are you all right? He's collapsed. Fetch a physician. What happened? Is he breathing? We must help him.
The wineglass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble. Duke Emeric slumped sideways in his chair, eyes shut, breathing slow and heavy, the perfect picture of a man drowned in his own cellar. "Your Grace?" Ondine knelt beside him, her voice barely a breath. "Your Grace, can you hear me?" What she did not know was this. His eyes were open behind those lashes, and every servant before her had already failed this very same test. But what she did next melted the coldest heart in all of England. Was she loyal, or was she about to make the one mistake that would cost her everything? If your heart is already racing, you do not want to miss what happens next. Subscribe right now and follow this channel. Ondine's fingers hovered over the fallen glass, its jagged pieces catching the candlelight like scattered ice. Her first thought was not for the wine soaking into the priceless rug. It was for him. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat, the way her mother had taught her years ago in a cottage that no longer stood. His pulse was steady. Too steady, she thought, for a man who had supposedly drunk himself into oblivion. But she was tired, and the hour was late, and she pushed the suspicion away before it could take root. "You cannot sleep here, Your Grace," she whispered. "You will ache come morning." Emeric Vachel, 9th Duke of Harrowmere, kept his breathing slow and shallow. Behind the veil of his lashes he watched her, this girl who had been in his household for 3 short weeks. He had seen a dozen servants stand exactly where she stood now. He had watched footmen slip coins from his coat while they believed him lost to drink. He had watched a lady's maid try on his late mother's pearls in the dark, laughing softly to herself. He had dismissed them all by dawn, and he had told himself he felt nothing when he did it. He expected the same from her. He always expected the same. That was the quiet poison that lived in his chest, the certainty that every soul who smiled at him wanted something, and every hand that reached toward him was reaching for his purse. But Ondine did not reach for his purse. She rose, gathered her skirts, and hurried to the hearth. She banked the dying fire with careful hands, feeding it kindling until warmth crept back into the study. Then she took the heavy woolen throw from the chaise, the one his mother had loved, and she draped it over him with a gentleness that made his jaw tighten against his will. "There," she said, so softly he nearly missed it. "You will be warm now." She did not know he could hear her. She had no reason to perform, and that was what undid him. Ondine Marchetti had learned long ago that the world did not soften itself for girls like her. She had buried her mother at 14 and her father's memory long before that, a man who had gambled away a modest inheritance and left nothing behind but a name that creditors spat when they said it. She had scrubbed floors in 3 houses before this one. She had been struck by a mistress in the first, cheated of wages in the second, and turned out of the third for the crime of catching the master's eye. She had learned to make herself small, quiet, invisible. She had learned that kindness cost nothing to give and was worth more than gold to receive, because no one had ever given it to her freely. So she gave it, even to a drunk duke who would not remember her name in the morning. She knelt again to gather the broken glass, wrapping each shard in her handkerchief so no other servant would cut themselves on it. Her hands were raw from the day's work, and one sharp edge sliced her thumb. She hissed, pressed the wound to her lips, and kept working. She did not curse him for it. She did not even frown. Emeric watched a bead of her blood fall onto the marble, and something ancient and wounded turned over inside him. "Who taught you to be this way?" he wanted to ask. "In a world that has clearly given you nothing, who taught you to give so much?" "You talk in your sleep, Your Grace," she murmured, almost to herself, as she rose with the wrapped glass cradled against her chest. "Last week I heard you. You said a name, Celeste." She paused at the door, her back to him. You said it like it hurt. His stillness became a different kind of stillness. His heart, which he had trained for years to feel nothing, slammed hard against his ribs. Celeste, his sister, dead 6 years, and no living soul in this house was supposed to know that name. He had scrubbed it from every record. He had forbidden the servants from speaking of the fever that took her while he was away at war. Away and useless and too late. He had built his entire cold and careful life around never hearing that name again. And this girl, this nobody with blood on her thumb and firelight in her hair, had spoken it aloud into the dark, gently, the way one might touch a bruise to see if it had healed. It had not healed. It never would. Ondine turned the handle. She thought her master slept. She thought no one had heard her foolish, tender words. She was already scolding herself for speaking them, because a maid who noticed too much was a maid who did not last. Wait! The word cracked through the room like the glass had. She froze. Slowly, so slowly, she turned back toward the chaise. The Duke of Harrowmere was sitting upright. His eyes were open. They were not the unfocused eyes of a drunkard. They were sharp and dark and fixed on her with an intensity that stole the breath straight from her lungs. He had not been asleep at all. "How long?" he said, his voice low and terribly quiet. "Have you known I was awake?" Ondine's mouth went dry. The wrapped glass trembled in her arms. Every position she had ever lost, every door that had ever closed on her, rose up behind her eyes at once. "Your Grace, I did not," she began. "That name." He stood. He crossed the room toward her, and there was nothing unsteady in his stride. "Where did you hear that name?" And Ondine realized, with a cold plunge of terror, that she had just made the one mistake she could not take back. "I heard it from you, Your Grace," Ondine said. The words came out steadier than she felt. "Only from you. 3 nights past, and again last week. You spoke it in your sleep. I swear on my mother's grave, I have never heard that name from another living soul in this house." Emeric stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw, the shadows carved beneath his eyes by something far heavier than wine. He searched her face the way a man searches a coastline for signs of a wreck. "You swear on your mother's grave," he repeated. "You would swear so easily on the dead." "I do not swear easily on anything." Her chin lifted. "My mother's grave is the only thing in this world I have left to swear on. I would not spend it on a lie." Something flickered behind his eyes. He had expected her to cower, to weep, to spin some frantic tale. He had not expected her to stand her ground with blood still drying on her thumb. He turned away from her then, and walked to the window, and looked out at the black gardens where the frost was beginning to silver the hedges. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Ondine stood clutching the broken glass, not daring to move, not daring to leave. She should have been terrified only of dismissal. Instead, she found herself watching the line of his shoulders, the way they carried a grief so large it had bent something in him. She knew that particular shape. She had worn it herself, walking away from her mother's fresh grave, with nothing but a bundle of clothes, and a name that opened no doors. Grief made strangers of everyone, she thought. It had made a stranger of her. Perhaps it had made one of him, too. "Celeste was my sister," Emeric said finally, to the window, to the frost, to no one. "She died while I was at war. Fever. It took her in 9 days, and I did not know until it was over. I came home to a fresh mound of earth, and a house that had already stopped saying her name, because they thought it would spare me." His voice did not break. It was worse than breaking. It was flat and hollowed out and utterly controlled. I forbade them from speaking it. I told myself silence was mercy. 6 years I have kept that silence. And then a housemaid I have known 3 weeks speaks it in the dark as though it were something tender. Ondine's throat tightened. She thought of all the words that had gone unsaid over her own mother, all the grief she had swallowed, because there was no one to hear it, and work would not wait for tears. "Silence is not mercy, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I know that better than most. Silence only teaches the hurt to live somewhere deeper, where no one can reach it." He turned from the window and looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she was not a housemaid to him, and he was not a duke to her. They were only two people who had learned the same hard lesson in different houses. "And what do you know of it?" he asked. There was no cruelty in it, only a terrible, weary curiosity. So she told him. She did not mean to. The words came before she could stop them, the way they always did in that hour of the night, when the world is asleep, and the truth grows too heavy to carry alone. She told him about the cottage that no longer stood, about a father who loved the card tables more than he loved the roof over his family's head, who signed away her future in a single ruinous night, and then had the poor grace to die of it, leaving her mother to cough her way through 3 brutal winters in a leaking room. She told him about scrubbing floors at 14, with hands too small for the work, about the mistress in the first house who struck her across the face for dropping a teacup, about the master in the third house whose eyes followed her down every corridor until his wife decided the easiest solution was to throw the girl into the street. "I learned to be invisible," she said. "A maid who is seen is a maid who is blamed. So I made myself into nothing. I kept my head down. I did my work. And I told myself I did not need anyone to be kind to me, because kindness never came, and wanting it only made the wanting hurt worse." Emeric listened to every word without moving, and as she spoke, he found the strangest thing happening inside his chest. The suspicion he had carried for years, the certainty that every servant was a thief and every kindness a con, began to crack down the middle. Because here was a girl who had every reason in the world to grasp and steal and lie, and instead she had covered him with his dead mother's blanket and wrapped broken glass in her own handkerchief so that no one else would bleed. "You covered me with that throw," he said. "Do you know whose it was?" "No, Your Grace. My mother's. She died the year before Celeste." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You have handled every grief in this house tonight, without knowing a single one of them." Ondine did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, and the silence between them changed shape, growing warmer and more dangerous by the second. He stepped closer. She should have stepped back. She did not. "Why did you not take anything?" he asked, and his voice had dropped low again, but softer now, stripped of its edge. "I have watched better people than you empty my pockets while they thought me senseless. You knelt in broken glass and cut yourself and asked for nothing. Why?" The candlelight was warm on his face. She could smell the wine he had only pretended to drink, and beneath it, something clean and warm that was simply him. Her heart was doing something foolish and unfamiliar, hammering against her ribs like it wanted out. "Because you were hurting," she whispered, "and no one deserves to hurt alone, not even a duke." For one suspended moment, neither of them breathed. His gaze dropped to her mouth and hers to his, and the whole cold house seemed to lean in around them, waiting. Then, from the corridor beyond the study door, came the sharp, unmistakable sound of a floorboard groaning under a careful foot. Someone was outside. Someone had been listening. And the name Celeste, spoken aloud in a house where it had been forbidden for 6 years, was no longer a secret between two people alone. Emeric's head snapped toward the door. Ondine's blood turned to ice. Who was standing on the other side of that door in the dead of night, and how much had they heard? Emeric moved before Ondine could draw breath. He crossed the study in 3 long strides and pulled the door open onto the dark corridor. It was empty, but the candle in the wall sconce still swayed on its wick, and the cold air carried the faint trace of rosewater and something sour beneath it. Someone had been there. Someone had fled the moment his head turned. He knew that scent. He had smelled it every day for 11 years. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, and the name fell from his mouth like a stone into a well. Ondine felt the floor tilt beneath her. The housekeeper, the woman who held every key in Harrowmere on the great ring at her waist, who decided which maid rose and which was cast out, who had watched Ondine since her first day, with eyes as flat and patient as a hawk, waiting for a rabbit to bolt. If Mrs. Pruitt had heard even half of what passed in that study, Ondine was finished. Worse than finished. A maid found alone with the Duke at this hour, speaking of forbidden things, standing close enough to be kissed, would not simply lose her position, she would lose her name, and her name was the only thing she had left to lose. "Your Grace, I must go," she said quickly, backing toward the door. "If she saw me here, if she thinks that we, please, I cannot be found here. You will not go anywhere." The command in his voice stopped her feet, even as her heart screamed at her to run. He was a duke again. Suddenly, the softness of moments before folded away behind a face carved from winter. "You do not understand," she pleaded. "A woman like me does not survive a rumor like this. You will wake tomorrow and forget tonight ever happened, but I will carry it into every house that turns me away for the rest of my life. I have nothing but my character, Your Grace. Please, let me protect the one thing I own." For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she watched something war behind his eyes. Then, quietly, he stepped aside from the doorway. "Go to your room," he said. "Speak to no one. Lock your door. I will deal with Mrs. Pruitt." She fled. She did not look back, though every part of her wanted to. She flew up the servant's stair with her heart in her throat and the wrapped glass still clutched against her chest. And she did not stop until her own narrow door was bolted behind her, and she had sunk to the cold floor with her back against the wood. She pressed her raw thumb to her lips and tasted blood and salt and shame. What had she been thinking? She had let a duke see her. She had told him things she had never told a living soul. She had stood close enough to feel the warmth coming off his skin, and she had wanted, for one reckless and impossible moment, to close the distance between them. Girls like her did not want dukes. Girls like her survived by never wanting anything at all. And yet, she could still see the way his face had changed when she said, "No one deserves to hurt alone." She could still feel the exact weight of his attention, the terrible, intoxicating shock of being seen by a man who had spent years making certain no one truly saw him either. Down in the study, Emeric did not sleep. He sat by the rekindled fire until the small hours, turning the night over and over in his mind. And near dawn, he made a decision that would have astonished every man who thought they knew the cold Duke of Harrowmere. He decided to learn the truth of her, not to trap her, not to catch her in a lie. He had spent 6 years assuming the worst of everyone who crossed his threshold, and it had made his house a mausoleum and his heart a locked room. For the first time since Celeste's death, he wanted to be wrong about someone. He wanted, desperately, for the girl on her knees in the broken glass to be exactly what she appeared to be. So the next morning he sent for his man of business, a discreet and clever fellow named Thibaut Rennick, and he gave him a single instruction: find out everything about Ondine Marchetti, where she came from, what houses she had served, what truth lay beneath the story she had told in the dark. Rennick returned within the week, and what he laid before the Duke turned the whole matter on its head. Every word she had spoken was true: the gambling father, the dead mother, the 3 houses. But there was more, a thing she had not told him because she did not know it herself. Her father's ruin had not been the simple misfortune of a weak man at the card tables. He had been deliberately fleeced, over the course of a single season, by a moneylender who had made a practice of hollowing out gentlemen of small fortune and seizing everything they owned. the deeds, the cottage, the future that should have been Ondine's, and the moneylender who had destroyed her family, who had reduced a gentleman's daughter to scrubbing floors, still lived and prospered not 30 miles from Harrowmere. He had grown fat and respectable on the ruin of a dozen families like hers. His name was Silas Vauclain. Emeric stared at the name on the page until the letters swam. He knew that name too. Silas Vauclain had been the man who, 6 years ago, held the loans against the Harrowmere estate, while the old duke lay dying, and the young one lay bleeding on a battlefield in Spain. Vauclain had circled this very house like a vulture, waiting to seize it, and had only been driven off when Emeric survived, came home, and paid the debt in full with the last of his mother's jewels. The same man had destroyed Ondine's family. The same man had tried to destroy his. The connection landed in his chest like a blow. This girl had not simply wandered into his house by chance. They had been wounded by the same blade, years and miles apart, and neither of them had ever known it. He set the papers down with hands that were not quite steady, and he understood in that moment that he could not send her away. Not now, not ever. Whatever was growing between them in the dark hours of that house, it was rooted in something older and deeper than either of them had guessed. But there was a complication, and Rennick delivered it last, and quietly. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, had not come to Harrowmere by ordinary means. 11 years ago, she had been placed there, recommended, with unusual insistence, by a lender who wished to keep an eye on his investment while the estate was still buried in debt. That lender had been Silas Vauclain. Mrs. Pruitt was his creature. She had been his eyes inside these walls for over a decade, and she had heard the forbidden name Celeste spoken aloud in the study, and she had heard a duke soften toward a nameless maid, and by now, every word of it would already be on the road to her master. Emeric rose so fast, his chair toppled behind him. He had to reach Ondine. He had to reach her before Mrs. Pruitt did, because a housekeeper serving Silas Vauclain would not simply gossip about the girl. She would recognize the name Marchetti. She would know exactly whose daughter had wandered, all unknowing, into the house of the one man her old master had failed to destroy. And a woman like that, cornered and loyal to a monster, would not hesitate to finish what her master had begun. He threw open the study door and strode into the corridor, calling for her, and the whole sleeping house began to stir at the sound of the master's voice, raised in something close to fear. But Ondine's room, when they reached it, stood open. Her narrow bed was made. Her few belongings were gone, and on the cold floor where she had wept the night before, lay a single thing that stopped the Duke's heart in his chest. Her mother's grave, she had said, was the only thing she had left to swear on. And there, dropped in her flight, lay the small, worn locket she had never once been seen without, the locket that held the only likeness of that mother in all the world. She would not have left it behind willingly. She had not left at all. She had been taken. Emeric bent and lifted the locket from the floor, as though it were made of glass. It was still warm. She had not been gone long. He did not shout. He did not rage. The cold that came over him was worse than any fury, a stillness that made the servants gathered in the doorway step back from him. He closed his fist around the locket, and when he spoke, his voice was very quiet and very sure. "Saddle my horse and find Mrs. Pruitt." But Mrs. Pruitt was gone too. Her keys hung abandoned on their hook, the great ring she had worn at her waist for 11 years, left behind like a shed skin. She had not needed them where she was going. She had delivered her prize and fled. Rennick found the stable boy shivering in the tack room, and the boy told them everything in a stammering rush. A carriage, in the last black hour before dawn, the housekeeper, and 2 men he did not know, and the maid, Miss Marchetti, with a cloth pressed to her face, and her body gone limp between them as they carried her out. They had taken the north road, the road that led, past the frozen fields and the old mill, to the estate of Silas Vauclain. Emeric was in the saddle before the boy finished speaking. He rode as he had not ridden since the war, low over the horse's neck, the frost stinging his face, the black hedges tearing past on either side. And as he rode, the locked room inside his chest broke open at last, and he understood, with brutal clarity, everything he had spent 6 years refusing to feel. He had let Celeste die alone. He had been away and useless and too late, and he had punished himself for it by making certain he never let anyone close enough to be lost again. He had told himself the coldness was strength. He saw now that it had only been fear wearing a crown. He had not been protecting his heart. He had been burying it, the way they had buried his sister, in silence and frozen ground. And now another woman he could not name his feelings for was being carried into the dark by the same evil that had circled his family for years, and this time he was not too late. This time he would not stand at a graveside and wish he had ridden faster. I am coming, he thought, and the thought was a vow. I am coming, and I will not lose you the way I lost her. Miles ahead, in a cold stone room that smelled of damp and old ledgers, Ondine woke. Her head throbbed. Her wrists were bound. She was slumped in a hard chair before a great desk, and behind the desk sat a man she had never seen and yet somehow knew, the way one knows a nightmare by its shape. He was soft and round and immaculately dressed, with small, pleasant eyes and a mouth that smiled without any warmth reaching it at all. Marchetti, Silas Vauclain said, tasting the name like a sweet. How the years turn. I ruined your father, girl. Did you know that? A weak man. He wept when he signed. And now here is his daughter, grown, and nesting in the one house that ever slipped through my fingers. He folded his soft hands. You have become inconvenient to me. You have made the cold duke feel something, and a duke who feels something is a duke who fights. I cannot have that. Harrowmere should have been mine. Ondine lifted her aching head and looked the monster full in the face. She was afraid. She would not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. But beneath the fear, something her mother had planted long ago straightened her spine. You took my home, she said. Her voice shook, and she let it shake. You took my father, and my mother's last years, and my whole life before I was old enough to fight you for it. And I survived all of it. I scrubbed floors, and I went hungry, and I made myself into nothing so that men like you could not find anything left to take. She leaned forward against her bonds. You will not frighten me now. I have already lost everything you could threaten me with. Everything but one. Vauclain's smile thinned. And what is that, pray? The knowledge, she said, that I am worth more than you. A man who builds his whole life on the ruin of others has nothing. You are the poorest man I have ever met. For the first time, the pleasant mask slipped, and something ugly moved beneath it. He rose from his chair, but before his hand could reach her, a sound rolled in from the winter dark outside. Hoofbeats, hard and fast and furious. A single horse ridden as though the devil himself were behind it. They stopped in the courtyard. A door was thrown open somewhere below. And then a voice Ondine knew, a voice she had heard soften over broken glass, and a dead sister's name rang up through the stone house like a blade drawn from its sheath. Vauclain. Ondine's heart leapt so hard it hurt. He had come. He had truly come. Vauclain's face went gray. He seized her bound arm and hauled her up out of the chair, dragging her toward the far door, even as heavy boots began to climb the stairs below. If he wants you, the moneylender hissed, and he can bargain for you. Or he can watch me finish what I began with your family. And with a strength his soft body should not have owned, he wrenched her through the door and into the dark passage beyond, just as the footsteps reached the landing, and the man she was only now admitting she loved threw open the empty room behind them. The empty room told Emeric everything. The overturned chair, the cut ropes on the floor, a far door still swinging on its hinge. He did not stop to think. He went through it at a run. The passage beyond was black and narrow, and he followed it by the sound of a woman struggling and a man cursing under his breath. It spilled him out onto a stone gallery above the old mill race, where the water ran fast and cold and loud beneath a low iron rail. And there, at the far end, Vauclain had Ondine backed against that rail, with her bound hands caught in his fist. "Not another step," the moneylender panted, "or I put her over the edge. That water has swallowed better than her. It will not give her back." Emeric stopped. Below the rail, the mill race churned white and merciless in the gray dawn. One shove, that was all it would take. He had ridden through the night to be too late, by a single arm's length. "Let her go, Vauclain," he said. "This is between you and me. It always was. You wanted Harrowmere. You circled my father's deathbed like carrion. Take your quarrel out on me, and let the girl walk free." "The girl," Vauclain sneered, "is the quarrel now. She has made you soft, and a soft man is a man I can finally break." His fist tightened. Ondine gasped, as the small of her back met the cold iron, and the roaring water yawned beneath her. Her eyes found Emeric's across the length of the gallery. And in that terrible suspended moment, she did the bravest thing she had ever done. She stopped being afraid. "He cannot break you," she called to Emeric, her voice clear above the water. "Do you hear me? Whatever happens to me, he does not win. You came. That is enough. You did not let me hurt alone." The words struck Emeric like a hand against his chest. They were his own words given back to him, the very thing she had said kneeling in broken glass, and hearing them now, with her life hanging over black water, cracked the last frozen thing inside him wide open. Ondine. Her name came out of him raw. "Do not say goodbye. I forbid it. I have buried enough. I will not bury you." Vauclain laughed, and it was that laugh that undid him, because Ondine, who had spent her whole life making herself small and still and silent, chose that instant to become none of those things. She drove her bound hands upward into the soft underside of the moneylender's arm, and threw her whole slight weight sideways, away from the rail, away from the water, sending them both crashing to the stone floor of the gallery. Emeric was already moving. He crossed the gallery before Vauclain could rise, and he hauled the man up by his fine coat and struck him once, cleanly, with 6 years of grief behind his fist. Vauclain went down and did not get up. He lay groaning on the wet stone, soft and round, and finally, utterly finished, while below him, the water he had meant for Ondine ran on without him. Then Emeric was on his knees, and his hands were on the ropes at her wrists, tearing them loose, and she was in his arms, before either of them decided to move. She was shaking, so was he. He pressed his face into her hair, and breathed her in, alive, warm, real, and for a long moment, neither of them said a single word. The reckoning came in the hours after, and it was thorough. Silas Vauclain did not escape a second time. Emeric had ridden with soldiers, and he knew how to build a case that would hold. Rennick had spent the week gathering every ledger, every ruined family, every forged deed the moneylender had left in his wake, and Ondine's abduction was the final stone that sank him. He was arrested before noon. The man who had built an empire on the ruin of gentle families lost everything to the law, and the deeds he had stolen, including the small cottage that had once been Ondine's, were pulled from his cold grip and returned to those he had robbed. Mrs. Pruitt was found at a coaching inn 20 miles off, waiting for a passage that would never come. 11 years she had served 2 masters in one house, and in the end, both were finished, and she had nothing to show for her long betrayal but a ring of keys she had left behind. She was handed to the magistrate without ceremony. Emeric felt nothing for her at all. and understood at last that this too was a kind of freedom, to stop hating the people who had wronged him and simply let them fall. That night, back at Harrowmere, the house was different, warmer, somehow, though the fires were no larger. Emeric found Ondine in the study where it had all begun, standing by the window with her mother's locket restored around her neck. "I have spent 6 years making this house a tomb," he said from the doorway. "I told myself I was keeping grief out. I was only keeping myself in." He crossed to her. "You walked into a house full of people who had learned to want nothing from me, because I punished wanting, and you wanted nothing either. You only gave. You covered a cold man with his mother's blanket, and you spoke his sister's name, as though it deserved to be spoken." He took her hands, the same hands that had bled on his marble floor. "I do not want you to be invisible anymore, Ondine. I have spent long enough being invisible myself. I would rather we were seen, together." Ondine looked up at him, at the man who had ridden through the frost for a maid the world had thrown away 3 times over, and she felt the last of the small, still silent thing inside her finally let go. "I stopped believing kindness would ever come to me," she whispered, "and then it rode through the dark to find me." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the raw place on her thumb where the glass had cut her, the wound that had started everything, and it healed something in them both. The cold Duke of Harrowmere was not cold anymore, and the girl who had made herself into nothing had, without ever meaning to, become the one thing he could not live without. But love, they would soon learn, is not the end of a story, because Vauclain had a partner no one had yet named, and that partner had watched the whole house of cards fall and knew exactly who to blame. The partner had a name, and it reached Harrowmere before the week was out. Her name was Cosette Vauclain, and she was Silas's younger sister, sharper than her brother had ever been, and twice as patient. Where he had been soft and greedy, she was lean and cold and clever, and she had run the quiet half of his enterprise from the shadows for years, the half that never appeared in any ledger Rennick had seized. She had watched her brother dragged before the magistrate. She had watched the deeds pulled from his grip. And she had decided that the cold Duke and his little maid would answer for all of it. But this time, Emeric did not wait in the dark to be struck. He had spent 6 years letting old wounds dictate his every move, flinching from the world before it could hurt him. That man was gone. The moment he learned of Cosette, he did not lock the doors and brace for a blow. He rode out to meet her. He found her at the very cottage that had once been Ondine's, the small stone house Rennick had recovered and restored, and which Ondine had asked to see with her own eyes. Cosette had gone there first, thinking to catch the girl alone, in the one place guaranteed to unmake her. Instead, she found them both, standing in the doorway of the home that had been stolen and given back, and she found a duke who was no longer afraid of anything she could threaten. "You are the last of it," Emeric said. "The last root of a poison that has fed on gentle families for a generation. Your brother is finished. His debts are called, and every family he ruined is being made whole, one deed at a time." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You can spend what is left of your life circling this house, waiting to strike. Or you can understand that there is nothing here left to take. We have already survived the worst you could do to us. You are not a threat to people who have stopped being afraid." Cosette looked from the Duke to the maid at his side, at the girl she had expected to find broken and had found instead standing straight and unafraid in her own doorway, her mother's locket at her throat and her chin lifted, and she saw the truth of it. There was no wound here left to press, no fear left to exploit. The two of them had passed through the fire her brother had built, and come out the other side, welded into something she could not break apart. She left without a word. Rennick and the magistrate had her within the month, on the strength of the very ledgers she had spent years keeping hidden, and the last root of the Vauclain poison was pulled from the earth for good. The families it had ruined would sleep easier, And Harrowmere, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, had nothing to fear from the dark beyond its gates. In the weeks that followed, the great cold house began to change from the inside out. Ondine no longer moved through it like a shadow, trying not to be seen. She threw open the shuttered rooms that had been closed since the old Duchess died. She had the dust sheets pulled from the furniture, the windows unlatched, the long silent music room aired, and its pianoforte tuned. She spoke Celeste's name aloud without flinching, and hung her portrait, long hidden in an attic, back in the gallery where a beloved sister belonged. And Emeric, watching her breathe life back into the tomb he had built, understood that she was doing for his house exactly what she had done for him that first night. She was covering it in warmth. She was refusing to let it hurt alone. They married in the spring, in the small chapel on the estate, with the frost long gone and the first green breaking through the hedges where it had once run silver and cold. There was no great society crowd. Ondine had not wanted one. She had spent her life among people who looked through her, and she had no wish to fill her wedding with strangers who would do the same. Instead, the pews held the servants of Harrowmere and Rennick, and a handful of the families whose stolen homes had been returned, people who owed their second chances to the same justice that had given Ondine hers. She stood before Emeric in a simple gown, with her mother's locket at her throat, and she thought of the girl who had once knelt in broken glass and told herself she needed no one's kindness because none would ever come. That girl had been wrong. She had been so tired and so certain and so wrong. Kindness had come. It had come in the shape of a man who pretended to be drunk to see who would rob him, and instead found the one person in the world who only wanted to keep him warm. "I spent years making myself into nothing," she said to him quietly, when the vows were spoken and the small crowd had drifted out into the spring sun. "I thought it was the only way to survive, and you spent years making yourself into ice for the very same reason. We were both hiding from the same thing." "And what was that?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew. "The fear of being seen," she said. "And loved anyway." He drew her close, there in the empty chapel, with the light coming warm through the old glass, and he pressed his forehead to hers, the way he had that first night over broken glass and a dead sister's name. "Then let this be the end of hiding," he said. "For both of us. No more invisible girl, no more frozen duke, only this." And he kissed her, slow and certain and unafraid, the cold finally gone from him for good. And the girl the world had thrown away 3 times over stood in the arms of a man who would never once let her go. Outside, the frost had melted from the hedges of Harrowmere, and somewhere in the warming house, a name that had gone unspoken for 6 long years was being spoken again, gently, the way one speaks the name of someone loved. The tomb had become a home. The ice had become a hearth, and 2 people who had learned to want nothing had, at long last, learned to want each other, and to believe that they deserved it. Some wounds do heal, not by forgetting, by finally being held.